Good morning and welcome to the Oasis Global Gathering. My name is Rebecca and I'm part of the leadership team at Oasis Church Waterloo. Whether you've been joining us since March or if this is your first time, you're really welcome and we're really glad you've joined us today. I've been thinking a bit over the last week about the importance of choosing to continue to opt in as the weeks go by. It feels like it would be easy to opt out of these gatherings. I could just have a lazy brunch, read a book and leave my laptop shut off in the corner. No one would notice, would they? But I've realised that it's important for me to have this point of connection, to be part of church community still. And every time I choose to be part of it, something in the comments makes me smile, or the prayers challenge me, the Connect slot gives me insight into the lives of others, even from a distance. Last week, Leanne asked everyone to comment in the chat box, to make their presence known, to participate and to say hello. I hope you know that we love seeing it when your names pop up, even just to say hello, and not one goes unnoticed. So please do show up, say hello, comment and join in if you can. Even from a distance, we can choose to opt in, to be part of community and to worship God together. This morning is the final Sunday of Black History Month. Steve will be interviewing Bristol Mayor Marvin Reeves. Dave Parr will be speaking to us in the next part of our series, Building Something Better, looking at some of the big questions of our theology. Dave will be talking to us on the topic of, did God let coronavirus happen? And then we'll also have a chance to pray and to reflect. As we begin, let's pray together. God of love, whatever this week has held for us, we thank you that you have been with us through every moment of grief or doubt or sorrow, and every moment of joy, gratitude and hope. Your love shines through every moment. May we have open hearts and minds as we gather this morning and as we choose to opt in to your love for us all. Amen. We're now going to hear from Steve as he interviews Marvin Reeves. They're going to talk to us about the life of civil rights activist Roy Hackett.
So I'm here with Marvin Reeves, the Mayor of Bristol. Marvin, welcome.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Marvin, I've been reading in the press recently that there's a suggestion made that Roy Hackett, most people would have never heard of Roy Hackett. Roy Hackett, a 90-year-old living in Bristol, is a very suitable replacement for the statue of Edward Colston that was torn off its plinth earlier in the lockdown. Why is that?
Well, isn't that a fantastic example of how we do history? As you said, most people wouldn't have heard of him. But Roy is someone who's made an incredible contribution to Bristol's story from relative anonymity, even though his name is increasingly well known. So Roy is part of the Windrush generation, worked hard, organised in the community, helped the St. Paul's Carnival get moving, was one of the organisers around the Bristol bus boycott as well, which actually was a gateway to much of our race equalities legislation at a national level. So he has had a local to a national level impact. And I guess that's why people are starting to pick him up. As we ask questions about who we remember in our history, which is what a history commission are asking now. And by extension, well, who have we forgotten in our history? So that's why I think it's about redressing those historical inequalities and recognising people who've contributed to making the world a better place.
Tell me a bit more about the Bristol bus boycott, because again, no one's ever heard of that, have they? Or very few people have heard of it. We've heard of the Birmingham bus boycott, and we all know about Rosa Parks, but the Bristol bus boycott and Roy Hackett, that's a different story.
Yeah, and lots of Bristol kids, I didn't know about it growing up. Bristol Omnibus Company, but were just basically not employing Black or Asian people. They just had a colour bar on their staff. And you think about the number of people that were coming to Britain in the 50s and 60s and were just being locked out of economic opportunity in some of these jobs. And so a group of local people, really central to them, Roy Hackett, Paul Stevenson, Guy Reed Bailey, decided to test what was going on. And so Guy Reed Bailey applied for a job. When he was offered an interview, and when he got to the interview, it was clear they were not going to give him the job because he was black. And the community had already organised to boycott the buses if it proved to be that there was a colour bar in place. And it was really much the forces of the status quo were organised against them, from unions to city council. And obviously there was a wider culture as well. I mean, there was some kind of, it's not shocking, unfortunately, but footage just saying that people felt it was too dangerous to have black people on the buses, or they'd never work with them, or the customers wouldn't get on the buses if they were there. And they launched the bus boycott. Interestingly, it was 1963 where they won their victory, the same year and actually the same date as Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So you had an iconic moment in world history for clearly making a clear statement about race equality.
Yeah, and as you said, Marvin, it was just a couple of years later on, wasn't it? 65, when the Race Relations Act was passed, and there was a direct link between the two, wasn't there?
There was, because the Bristol bus boycott got national attention, including from the Prime Minister. Yeah, I just think it caused many people in leadership positions in the country to ask questions about who we are and how we operate, and how we're going to ensure that we operate in a more fair way. Clearly that wasn't solved, but these things are rarely solved. What we do is we make progress towards them.
So Roy would be a real good candidate to go on that plinth.
He would, but I'm being very careful about that because I think actually at this moment in time, an empty plinth is actually quite apt. We are a city in a country that is looking for answers and doesn't have them. And what we choose to commemorate, celebrate, and I think statues do celebrate, they don't teach history, they celebrate history. It is to celebrate almost that searching period that we're in at the moment. In the end too, dare I say, I think we should also consider that plinths not just be there for statues of individuals, but also be there for symbols of moments and movements in time. Because most moments and movements and periods of dramatic change are down to whole groups of people, lots of them anonymous, as well as those people who are the spokespeople.
So how do we get, I've heard you talk about symbolism before. Statues are important symbols, aren't they, in the end, as you're saying, but how do we get beyond symbolism to structural change, which is what we've got to see, isn't it? How do we build on the work that people like Roy Hackett did all those years ago?
Well, I think it starts by being very clear on what we're talking about. So I expressed my concern. Well, I saw the felling of the statue as historically poetic. A slaver involved in the kidnap of 80,000 people, 18 to 20,000 of whom would have died, been thrown overboard of the ships for the sharks en route, being rolled through the streets, was a phenomenally symbolic act for the city and the country. So I don't take away from that. But as I shared, my concern was, unless you attach that to real policy, you end up just feeding on symbolic acts, and that leads to cynicism in the end, because fundamentally things don't change. I've seen that within the church, dare I say, where we have got churches together, the people have prayed together, sung together, and then gone home, but they've gone home to inequality. And people said, well, we sung and we prayed, but what has fundamentally changed? My children, my brown-skinned children, are still born disproportionately likely to die early, become unhealthy, and to be poor than your children, right? So what the singing and praying matter. So it has to be attached to real policy. We have to know what we're talking about, and what we're talking about are inequalities in educational outcomes, inequalities in housing, wealth, levels of unemployment, sickness, experience of the criminal justice system. Unless we attach our efforts to making meaningful change in those numbers, I think we end up underserving ourselves and sowing the seeds for future cynicism.
As you look forward, Marvin, you talked about your young children. Do you think that there is the possibility that by the time your age, they will live in a society that is free of racial inequality?
No, I don't. I think it's a very, very long-term game. Because again, it's clear, I think people often look to what they see as changing attitudes. The days of me being chased down the street by groups of men and, you know, calling me whatever name and wanting to put me in hospital, those are not so common anymore, although we have to be clear. We've had a spike in race hate crime in the city, post-Brexit particularly. And I imagine those tensions will continue. We see the tone of politics we have around us at the moment as well, which is quite unfortunate, to put it mildly. But we do make progress on what's seen as acceptable and not acceptable in our social interactions. But the underlying data is not very different. Again, life expectancy, healthy years, life expectancy. And you overlay that beyond the race. Just look at the issue of class and inequality in general, of which race is a part. You overlay that on the fact that inequality is worsening. As we go into COVID and this economic depression, it would be the lower income people, ordinary people, not even just low income people now, who are going to be hit first and hardest, and who are going to be the least well placed to benefit from any economic uptick. We continue to live in one of the in a country with amongst the lowest levels of social immobility in OECD. That means that the circumstances of your birth, whatever your race, are amongst the most significant indicators of where you end up in life. If we haven't solved these issues of social immobility, and I don't think we look likely to solve them soon, we can't make a claim to have solved the issues of race inequality, because the two are interdependent.
Marvin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve and Marvin. And thanks to everyone who has contributed by telling the stories of incredible Black leaders and pioneers over the last few Sundays. I hope we'll be hearing some more of their stories very soon. Now it's time for our Bible reading from Genesis 1, and then over to Dave for our talk this morning.
Today's reading is from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 31. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day.
Good morning, my name's Dave, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm part of the leadership team at Oasis Church Waterloo. I want to start this morning by telling you a story. It's a fantastic story, a creation story. It's the story that starts like this. Out of the chaos, two gods were formed, a god and a goddess, Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu and Tiamat were husband and wife and had some godlet children, but the children were noisy, they were tempestuous, they irritated their parents, they kept their father awake at night. And one night Apsu is lying awake, not able to sleep, and decides the only thing he can do to solve this problem is to wipe out his children. So Apsu decides he's going to have to kill all his children. Tiamat doesn't want that to happen. She warns her children. She hopes they'll quiet down and give Apsu a break. But what actually happens is that one of the children sneaks into Apsu's bedroom at night and kills his father in his sleep. Tiamat's distraught. She's furious. She consults her advisors and says, "What on earth should we do about this?" and decides that the only thing she can now do is go to war with her children too. And so she sets off into battle with her children. And in the great battle that ensues, the strongest of her children, Marduk, rises up and shoots Tiamat with an arrow. The gruesome story goes on to say that Marduk tears the body of Tiamat apart, and out of one half of her body he makes the heavens, and out of the other half of her body he makes the earth. And Marduk, now the king of the gods, goes after the advisor who advised Tiamat, and he finds the advisor and he says, out of you I'm going to make a man to look after the earth, to make sure that the chaos is kept in control. And so out of the advisor he makes the first man and says to the man, you are the servant of the gods. Look after this chaos, make sure it doesn't get out of control in order that the gods are set free. That's a great story, isn't it? It's from something called the Enuma Elish. It's a gruesome story. It's the first Babylonian creation myth. And it's one of the oldest creation myths. And the reason I tell you that is because then we read earlier that little passage from Genesis on the first page of the Bible. The creation story that's in the Bible tells a narrative where God of love creates all things and blesses it. He creates the sky and he creates the earth and the waters and he blesses it and says it's good. And then he creates plants and animals and says they're good. And then he makes humankind, male and female, in his image. And he says at the very end of it, and it is very good. Couldn't be a bigger contrast between that creation story of violence and the creation story that we read on the first page of the Bible, which is a story of love, a story of equity, a story of a God who's blessing things, a story of a God that says humanity's not the servant of the gods to set the gods free. Humanity's there in the image of God to rule over and to steward and to be part of with me. In fact, that story was probably written while the Jewish people were in exile in Babylon and could have been a direct comparison with the Babylonian violent creation story. And I tell you any of that because we're about to answer the question, why did God let coronavirus happen? And we can only really answer that question in my mind if we start with this first principle, that the meta theme of the Bible, the meta theme of the story of Christianity, the meta theme is that God is the God of love. It's written on the first page of the Bible and the last page and everywhere in between. If we come up with any conclusions to that story which don't look like the God of love, if we come up with any conclusions to the way we think about coronavirus that don't look like the God of love, we've probably got them wrong. So we're going to tackle that question. First thing I would say about the question, why did God allow coronavirus to happen? I think it's a bad question, a leading question. The question puts it like this, that God has allowed coronavirus and we've just got to work out why. Well, I'm here to say that, in my opinion, God did not orchestrate coronavirus, nor has God necessarily got the power to step in and stop it happening, but is choosing not to. Now, those are two huge things to say, so I will come back to them. But God didn't, in my opinion, orchestrate coronavirus, nor has he got the power to step in and is choosing not to use that power. And in my opinion, that paints quite a malign God if you go down that road. Second thing I would say about the question is that in the midst of pain and suffering, and we are patently in the midst of pain and suffering together, it's the wrong time to start theorising about, well, what's God's role in this? How was creation formed? It's the wrong time to theorise about anything, frankly. In those moments of pain and suffering, we've got to stop together, say this is terrible, it's not the way it's supposed to be, grieve together, lament together. I think into creation is written this rich, deep seam of love, powerful, original goodness, written into the fabric of humanity and all of creation. But I think equally, in our creation, there is obviously something that doesn't quite work sometimes, something that's a bit broken, something that's sometimes out of kilter. When we see murders happen in our world, that's not the wonderful will of God. It's terrible. It's not the way it's supposed to be. When we see violence happening around the world, that's not the will of God. It's just not the way it's supposed to be. When we see children dying young, that's not the will of God. It's just not the way it's supposed to be. When we see disease and we see coronavirus, in my opinion, that isn't the will of God. It's not the way it's supposed to be. It's wrong. I think when pain and suffering is happening, we've got to stop, grieve, acknowledge it, say it's not the way it's supposed to be. Grieve together, grieve with one another, and in my opinion, grieve with a God who is anguished alongside us and grieving with us. See, I think the problem is when we try and square the circle of God is all loving and God is all powerful, and we end up coming up with some conclusions that do not look like the God of love. Therefore, theologians over the centuries have grappled with that issue and said, well, why does pain and suffering happen in our world? Augustine, for instance, has a go at that and says, well, it's something to do with original sin, it's something to do with the fall and Adam and Eve and the world being cursed, but a redemption plan is on its way. In my opinion, that still leaves a quite difficult. God is still all powerful, so I guess could choose to step in, but he's not into pain and suffering. It puts lots of the blame on humanity for the brokenness of the world. It also seems to say, although you've got a part to play while the world's cursed, you've got to sort of sit this one out until the redemption plan comes. And to be honest, that leaves me in a difficult place with understanding God. Another theologian, Irenaeus, had a go at answering this problem, and Irenaeus says, actually, pain and suffering is an opportunity for maturity, for mankind to move on, to grow. And I guess that is true. We can probably all think of situations where we've grown and matured as a result of pain and suffering. But it's not always true. And are we really saying that the God of love allows refugees to die in a boat in the Mediterranean so that humanity can learn and grow? Are we really saying that the God of love allows people to live lives of complete pain in order that people can grow and mature? Again, that is a difficult God for me to understand. There's a third option. It's called process theology, if you want to go and look it up. But process theology says perhaps we ought to think God is a bit less in control, a bit less powerful than we might think. We should think that God is supremely loving, more loving than we could possibly imagine. But perhaps God isn't in control in quite the way that we think. God's got a persuasive power. God's trying to encourage us to step into creation alongside him. God's got a persuasive power that's saying, step in, become part of the process, become part of the journey, be part of creation. You've got a role to play too. And in the midst of that, I guess there's a question. Why worship a God who's not all powerful? Why bother worshipping that God? Well, in my opinion, I would say, why have we put power and control on such a pedestal? The metal theme of the Bible isn't about power and control. That creation story we read in Genesis isn't about power and control. It's about love. 1 Corinthians 13, that great story about the character of God, doesn't finish with, and the greatest of these is power. It finishes with, the greatest of these is love. Why have we put power and control on such a pedestal for being the reason to worship God? In my opinion, God is the God of love. God is the God of solidarity that's in it with us. God is the God who's on our side. God is the God of relationship and persuasion. But perhaps God is less in control than we think, or in control in a different way to the way we've imagined. None of that really answers the question, well, why was creation ever created like this? And frankly, I think there's mystery in that question. I think it's probably got something to do with the free will of human beings, but I think there's mystery in it. But because I can't answer that question, I'm not left feeling hopeless. I think, as I said at the start, there's this rich seam of love and goodness, original goodness, powerful force built into the creation and built into all of humanity. And I think, frankly, even despite some of the brokenness we see around us, it's the most powerful thing there is going. I think the arc of history is genuinely tending towards a creation where all tears will be wiped away. And so I think we've got a part to play. I think we are called to step into that creation, to grieve sometimes at the things where they're not in control, to grieve with God sometimes for the things that are not quite right. But we've got to put love into action. We've got to look for the places where injustice is happening and say, our job here is to grieve, lament, and then put love into action. And so as we think about coronavirus, I think our job is to stop, say, this isn't right. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. Grieve, lament with one another and with God, and then say, what can we do to step in, put love into action, and make sure that injustice doesn't exist in our world? And we see so many stories within coronavirus where it's pointed out to us the great injustices that there are in our societies. So I think that's our job. Stop, reflect, lament, grieve, and then put love into action.
Thanks, Dave. I'm sure for some of us, the topics we've been discussing will have raised some more questions, or there might be questions that you'd like to explore a bit deeper. If you do want to do this, you can sign up for Being Human, a 4-week course exploring what following Jesus and being part of Oasis Church is really all about. The course is being run online this time and will begin on November the 4th at 7:30 p.m. To find out more or to sign up, go to oasiswaterloo.org/being-human. Let's take some time now to think about some of the ideas Dave has shared with us this morning and to pray. God, in the beginning, you saw what you had made, and it was very good. In your image, humankind was created. I wonder where you saw the goodness of God this week. The wonder of creation, the kindness of a stranger, or a moment of joy. Take a moment to think and to thank God for that goodness. I wonder where you saw the pain of the brokenness of humanity this week. A hurt you experienced, a loss you felt, a sense of grief that you couldn't shake. Take a moment to ask God for hope and for comfort in that pain. I wonder where you saw injustice this week. What made you angry? What made you feel passionately that something has to change? Take a moment to ask God for the courage and the perseverance to stand up against injustice and to take action. I wonder where you saw God's uncontrolling love in action this week. The sharing of a kind word or encouragement. The small action that reminded you that you are loved. Take a moment to thank God for those who have shown you love and ask God to help you show that love to those around you in the coming week. God, in the beginning, you saw what you had made, and it was very good. In your image, humankind was created. Help us to bear that image well this week. May we be the light in the darkness. May we be bringers of your hope, your love, and your kingdom on earth in the here and now. Amen. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. That's nearly it for this week. We're going to end by singing the song Rise by Common Hymnal, led by Timo and the band. Thanks for being part of our global gathering, and I hope you have a great week.
There's a fire in the belly of the nations you have called. There's a power that breaks the silence of the souls with pain untold. and we'll lay it on the line, and we'll leave it all behind. Lord, let us rise, 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 rise like you rose from the grave, and we'll shine, 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 shine like the stars in the sky, reflecting your love. We'll walk through the light of the sun. There's a voice that speaks deliverance, that shouts with faith and love, till the hands and feet of Jesus live in all our shoes and gloves, and we'll lay it on the line, and we'll leave it all behind. Lord, let us rise, 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 rise like you rose from the grave, and we'll shine, 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 shine like the stars in the sky, reflecting your love. We'll walk through the light of the sun. We'll live like you already wanted us. We'll live like your kingdom has come. We'll live like you already wanted us. We'll live like your kingdom has come. We'll live like you already wanted us. We'll live like your kingdom has come. We'll live like you already wanted us. We'll live like your kingdom. Lord, let us rise, 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 rise like you rose from the grave, and we'll shine, 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 shine like the stars in the sky, reflecting your light.